What is up, Scream Team? Zach Cherry here, and we've come to the very end of 2022, so that means that I get to rank every horror movie that was released, at least the ones that I've seen, in a tier list. Personally, I wanted to see as many horror movies as possible, so aside from theatrical releases, I also got all the ones that were released to streaming, whether that be Netflix, Prime, Shudder. I feel like this goes without saying, but it's something that I need to say with every ranking video, is that this is just my opinion. And especially for this list, because we're dealing with so many movies, this is not so much based on the quality of the film. There's a lot of movies that I'm probably gonna rank lower down that are very well made, but personally I just didn't enjoy them. So having said that, let it start at the beginning. I've got these all listed alphabetically just to streamline it a little bit better. And the first one I have is The Apology. This was released on Shudder. And this one, I think for what it is, I actually really enjoyed it. There's a lot of movies released on Shudder, and a lot of them are gonna be on here, and I think that this was probably one of the better ones. This one's kind of like a stage play almost, like it's a single setting, there's very few characters, but there's a lot of mystery, and that kind of unravels over a decent pace. On the more negative end, I feel like the stakes are never really very high in this one. So there's not really a strong sense of horror or suspense, and something like that probably would have elevated this more, but I'm going to still say that this is a decent entry from Shudder, so I'm going to put that in perfectly fine. Next up we have Barbarian. Honestly, folks, I wanted to like this movie. I think that it has a spectacular first act. I think that the first act of this movie, like, I would put that in instant favorites. It's so well done. I just don't know how they could go so wrong so quickly. I think of a movie like Psycho, where that's actually a really good example of a movie that completely shifts gears partway through, and the story that we thought we were following, we're no longer following. We've got something new. And whereas like that was really compelling, it was almost like, here's a great story, but here's an even better story. And I feel like Barbarian was an example of like a really good story, but never mind that, we've got something else for you. And it didn't really work for me. And it was just, it wasn't even a different story. It was just kind of a different person, same situation. And then it just kind of went off the rails for me. Again, I really wanted to like this movie, but I'm gonna say that this is perfectly fine. I'll put it above The Apology. Barbarian is memorable. I can give it that. Next up is Bed Rest. This was released very recently on Tubi. It stars Melissa Barrera of Scream 5. This is just kind of like one of those by the numbers haunted house movies. It's just got like the same recycled premise of a wife seeing supernatural things and her husband just kind of like being skeptical. So I kind of feel like this movie is like 20 years too late. I'm gonna put it in trying my patience, because I actually got pretty bored of this one after a while. So next up we have The Black Phone. This is from the same director, Scott Derrickson, as Sinister. I do really like that movie. I think it's really effective in what it does just in terms of building an atmosphere. I think that where that movie kind of failed was that the characters were pushed to the wayside. With Black Phone, I feel like it's almost the opposite effect, where the horror is really just kind of like forgotten about, but the characters are really developed. But I just think that the story was really half-baked. Like this probably could have used a rewrite or two. There's just some plot twists that feel like they were just sort of set up for the sake of having this like misdirection that never really was earned or even paid off when it happened. And then just in terms of like the film's villain, played by Ethan Hawke, he's barely a presence in this. And even when he's there, I never feel like there's a threat. Like there's no sense of urgency with this movie. It's a very, like, the villain is just very passive. It's just almost just like waiting for things to happen that don't even happen. It's gonna go in perfectly fine. I just don't know if it's above or below Barbarian. I'm gonna put it above just for now. We'll see if I move things around afterwards. Blood Relatives, this was another Shudder release. This is more of a comedy, a vampire comedy movie, and it's a cute movie. The problem with this for me was that the pacing was really bad, because the movie really didn't start until closer to the end, or just kind of like the hijinks that I wanted to see. This one I'm gonna say is trying my patience. I understand this is probably a labor of love for those who made it, but I wasn't enjoying it as much as I wanted to. Bodies, bodies, bodies. You know, I love murder mysteries, and I can't really talk much about without like spoiling it. The thing is, like, this reminds me of like the Gen Z version of a very specific 80s slasher movie that if I revealed what movie it is, it might give away the premise. But I think like what works about this movie for me is that, you know, rather than just being another horror movie with Gen Z characters infused into the story, it's more so a satire on Gen Z. If there was kind of like, you know, more of a modern day murder mystery type movie, this would be, you know, the closest equivalent to Scream. It just doesn't have the, you know, the iconic ghost face killer or anything like that, but it's still a lot of fun, and it took me for a loop. Like, I was completely surprised by, you know, everything in the end. So definitely recommend this one. I'm going to say that this is something I'm going to be watching on repeat. I already own it. I bought it, so I'll definitely be watching it a lot. Next up is The Cellar. Similar to Bedrest, this is a movie that, you know, we've seen 100 times before. It's a family moving into a haunted house. Most of it is exposition of just like finding out new things or what this means or what that means. And you can only take that so far before it starts to really wear down on the story and get boring. Honestly, for me, like the thing that intrigued me the most was sort of like the lives of these people and like how it was affected. And it's set up to, you know, kind of be part of the plot, but it's never really explored. You know, it really takes away the more psychological elements in place for just trying to explain the paranormal. And you know, when you explain the paranormal too much, that's when it like doesn't become scary anymore. So I'm gonna say that this one is trying my patience. I think it's better than Bedrest. Okay, next we have Christmas, Bloody Christmas. This is, you know, campy, fun. The premise of this is it's essentially like Terminator, but with like a store Santa, like an animatronic Santa that, you know, malfunctions and goes on this killing spree. You know, it's like this modest little movie that was refreshingly character driven for the first half, but then they kind of switch gears and it becomes more so like action oriented. And everything like with the character development is just kind of like thrown to the wayside just to have these like big action set pieces, which I mean, when I say big action set pieces, like on a budget, it tried my patience, but I still think that this is better than anything that it tried my patience. So I'm going to say this is perfectly fine. I'll put it at the bottom of that tier for now. Next, we have Crimes of the Future. At this point, I've just realized that David Cronenberg is not for me. This movie just feels like it's a lot of scenes of just talking and theory and exposition and like almost like political stuff that I just tune out. I don't even know what's going on in this movie. It just is way too esoteric for me. I think that there's definitely quality to be found. Like it's a beautiful looking movie, but it's just the kind of strange that it didn't capture my interest. Like I like bizarre things, but I like something that is at least tangible enough that I can wrap my brain around it. And this one I couldn't. I don't want to say that it's time I'll never get back, but honestly I'd rather watch something stupid like Bedrest over this. I get more out of that. So I'm gonna put this at the bottom of trying my patience. Next up we have The Cursed, and this movie is a slog to get through. I mean, like I just talked about Crimes of the Future and just exposition upon exposition. This movie is also a period piece. It's actually a flashback of a flashback. Like it's a period piece within a period piece. And period pieces, like not that I'm against, you know, seeing something that's supposed to take place in the, you know, early 20th century or the 19th century. But I mean, you have to really find a pace and an intriguing story. And this one just didn't do it for me. Like narratively, it's so hard to follow when movies are like that. So I'm gonna put it in trying my patience. I think I don't want to put anything in the bottom unless like I really hated it. Next up is Dark Glasses, or Occhiali Neri. This is Dario Argento's first movie in 10 years. It's been a long time since I've seen a Dario Argento movie that I've really loved. Like he's one of my favorite directors, but all of his good stuff is in the past. Like it's all like in the 70s and the 80s, and there are some gems in the 90s and the early 2000s. I don't know, it's just like his big return, or not a big return, but you know, a return after a long hiatus. I was just expecting more. I'm gonna say that this was trying my patience. It's different though, like it's bizarre and like a good kind of bizarre, I guess. I'll probably put it above blood relatives. So now we come to Day Shift, which was a big Netflix release. This really kind of like has the trappings of, just being like a first time director. And I know that the director's experience in this was mostly in stunt coordination, and you can really feel that. It's a comedy horror, and like, it's not funny. I don't find it funny at all. So I don't know, just because it's kind of shot around its action set pieces, there's this heavy emphasis put on fight scenes, but everything else is just, it's so devoid of enthusiasm. I don't know, it just wasn't for me. I haven't heard anyone say anything positive about this. I'm sorry if you did like it, but this one is trying my patience. So far, we're not off to a good start here. I'm gonna put this one below Bed Rest. Next up is Deadstream. This was another Shudder movie. This was a charming and fun little surprise, I'll say. It's basically, the premise is like an Evil Dead 2 as like a live stream found footage movie. It's very interactive, just like how it's done, like very avant-garde, and I almost feel like this is what Halloween Resurrection wishes that it could be, when they had the idea of like a live stream in a haunted house. I might watch this on repeat. I would watch this again, because initially I thought I would put this in Perfectly Fine, but I'm just thinking about it and it was really fun, so I'm gonna put it there. So next up we have Fall. And like, not your conventional horror movie, but what I was so surprised at was like really discovering for me that the scariest thing is heights. Like, I cannot deal with anything that involves heights of any kind, and it's all like shot really well. Like, I know that there was stuff involved of like practical locations. I don't know if I would watch it again though, because I feel like it's one of those movies that you watch once and you get enough out of it, and also it's like terrifying, but I know the outcome, so it probably wouldn't be as effective the second time. But I'm gonna say I'm watching this on repeat. I'm gonna put this below Bodies. This was a really scary movie for me. Next up is Firestarter, and there's just something so reductive about remaking horror movies in 2022. Like, that was such a mid-2000s thing. This was a movie that nobody was asking for, and there's still no evidence to show us that we needed it. But I think that worst of all, like, this movie failed for me because structurally it's a huge mess. They spend way too much time kind of like setting up these characters, this family and the girl, where it's just almost like this is a remake. Like, if anything, you can kind of capitalize on the fact that people are already somewhat familiar with the premise. So there's so much time wasted of just like going through the motions. And then like before you know it, the movie's over. We go from point A to point B and there's really nothing that guides us there. I really did not enjoy this movie at all. This is going to be time I'll never get back. Next up we have Fresh, and this was Hulu released. I thought this movie was okay, but it was also really frustrating and not fun at all. And I think that this movie was trying to be fun, like it was like presenting itself as a movie that was fun, and it just like never registered that way for me. Like, it's good, it's really well done, and I think it's effective, but it's not one that I ever want to watch again. So I'm gonna say that this was perfectly fine. I'm gonna put it below The Apology. Then we have Glorious. It's a very interesting movie. I think that there's some twists and turns along the way, and despite being in like one location, it does do a really good job of being engaging throughout. I just don't think it's terribly memorable for me, but it's perfectly fine. Like, I would recommend it. So I'm gonna say I'll put this below Fresh. Next up is Gone in the Night. This is another one I really wanted to like. I was really excited for it. Winona Ryder, who I love. I feel like a lot of the characters in this do make like frustrating decisions, like just terrible decisions. The plot more so unfolds through like this character passivity, but I think what doesn't work for me is like how the movie's framed, because it does it like as a mystery, but everything is kind of revealed through these flashbacks and like flash sideways. Like, by the time we get to the end, the movie basically spoon feeds like everything for us. So I did not love this movie. I'm gonna put this in Trying My Patience. I'll probably put it above The Cellar, below Blood Relatives. That seems like a fair spot for it. Next up is Goodnight Mommy. This is a remake of an Austrian film from 2014, which I never saw. And as far as I know, this is also a remake, or that was a remake of an American film from 1972 called The Other, which I've also never seen. So this is not new ground. I was surprised because I actually enjoyed this one, and I was looking up reviews after, and like people were kind of crapping all over it and just saying how it's not as good as the original, like the one that came out in 2014. And I believe it, but I still don't think that that makes this one bad. And, you know, even like being a remake notwithstanding, I still think that it's effective for what it is. Like, this is a movie that I might watch it again, like in a long time from now, but I think that it's perfectly fine. I would actually put this above Black Phone. Controversial maybe, but that's where I'm gonna put it. Now we're coming to the big controversy of the ranking. I mean, if you guys have watched by Halloween and stuff, you know that I don't hate it. We'll just say that. I mean, this movie is a mess. It's a huge mess, but I think emotionally, it was kind of the most hard-hitting of any of the Blumhouse trilogy. And I think the problem inherently with Halloween Ends is the lack of narrative focus. They invested so much time into the Corey stuff, which I thought was great. Like, I liked that movie. I liked the movie that we were watching, but then they kind of carelessly tossed it away to close out the story that we had been following for the past, like, 2 films. So if David Gordon Green wanted to make an original screenplay or a remake of Christine, as people have said Corey's plot line is, kind of, like, I think that he should have done that independently outside of the Halloween franchise. But it is baffling that they, you know, had to use Halloween for this vehicle, especially when this is kind of like the last chapter. You want to close out this trilogy. I wish, you know, it had just picked a lane. Just either you're going to do the Corey stuff or you're going to do Michael Myers. And I think I would have preferred if it had all just been Michael Myers, because that's kind of what this is. I still enjoy this movie. I understand completely why people hate it. But, you know, all things considered, it takes risks. And they don't always pay off. I mean, most of the time they don't. But this is hardly the worst of the franchise. And it's certainly not my least favorite of the year. And just because it is Halloween, and I do think it's better than not a lot of the Halloween movies, but, you know, some of them, I'm gonna put this on watching on repeat. I'm gonna put this above Deadstream, because I mean, as much as I or any of us really are gonna say that like we hate this movie, we're all gonna watch it. Like, even all of our favorite franchises, we suffer through them. That's kind of the beauty of it. Next up, we have Hellbender. This is a very strange movie, and I think this was a good combination of like abstract storytelling with psychological and supernatural horror. So I definitely think this is worth a viewing, but the story and the horror don't really stand out enough for me. Like, I don't know how memorable it is. I'm gonna say it's perfectly fine. I'll put it below Glorious. I think that works for me. Next up, we have Hellraiser. I think in the grand scheme of the Hellraiser franchise, this is a breath of fresh air. You know, like, I've sat through all of those movies recently, some of them for the first time. They are not good. This one is better than most of them, but still, it doesn't really do much for me. Like I think visually this movie has some stunning imagery, and I love the innovations that they made with the puzzle box itself. That was kind of like a very interesting expansion on the mythology of Hellraiser. But overall, this is a very forgettable movie. Like, the characters are so one note. I think that the relationship between the siblings, which is kind of the strongest aspect of it, just in terms of the characters, and they kind of threw that to the wayside very early on, and I don't think like any of the other characters really worked for me, or just like in terms of like the main character, I didn't really bond with her. Like, I didn't feel a connection. Like, she was a drug addict, and it felt very exploitative because nothing in the movie like really pertained to anything other than just kind of like having a little bit of color to it. And I think that like the thing that connected me most to her was the relationship with her brother. It was just strange that, you know, the decisions that they made. I just feel like with a big franchise like this, that they were kind of like making this grand re-entrance. I expected a little bit more. So I'm gonna say that this is perfectly fine. I'll say below Barbarian. Next up is I Came By. This is more so a crime thriller than horror. This kind of has a Don't Breathe vibe to it. Like, it's like the British Don't Breathe in a way. And I definitely think this one is worth checking out. This is on Netflix, but it's kind of plagued by a few things. Like, you know, already talking about the lack of urgency. The characters are super frustrating, you know, constantly making bad decisions. The main character in this, who doesn't really do anything for the whole movie, like I wasn't even sure that he was the main character. He just kind of like emerges at the end after being incredibly passive. So that doesn't really make for a very interesting or engaging character to follow. But I think that still, for what it was thrilling. I think it did a good job. And for those reasons, I'm going to put it in perfectly fine. I'm going to put this above Black Phone, below Goodnight Mommy. Next up, we have The Invitation. This is kind of like a modern day update of The Brides of Dracula. And this is kind of my guilty pleasure of the year, I'll say. Like, this is not a great movie by any means, but it's not terrible. It's a movie that knows what it is and makes no apologies for that. Like, you know, we've seen this movie before. We'll see it again, I'm sure. But yeah, it's mindless fun. It's predictable. And, you know, I think it is perfectly average. It entertained me thoroughly. So I'm actually going to say that this is perfectly fine. I put it at the top of perfectly fine. Yeah, I really dug this movie. Now we come to Jeepers Creepers Reborn. Just to kind of preface this, I have never really been a big fan of this franchise. And from what I understand, or just like the consensus from everyone, is that this is the worst one. And yeah, this is really bad. This almost feels like this was not intended to be a Jeepers Creepers movie. Like, it was a spec script that then was sort of like purchased and became like the creeper was sort of implemented into it. Most of this feels like stage directions. Like, there's no real set pieces or anything. It's sort of like characters moving from one room to the next, some sort of scare, and then like going to another environment. The characters are extremely unlikable. I just don't even know what this movie was about. It did not interest me. It didn't look good. I haven't heard a single good thing about it from anyone, so I don't feel guilty about putting this at dead last, which I will see. It'll probably remain there. Next up, we have Mad God. This is entirely visual. Like, this is all stop motion animation. And apparently this was produced, made over the span of 30 years, which is extremely impressive. But there's not really a storyline. It's certainly the most ambitious stop motion animation movie that I've ever seen, especially in terms of like horror and just the very creepy and disturbing, gross imagery in it. That I think this is perfectly fine. I think that I'll put it above Bloody Christmas, because I don't know if I'd ever watch it again. Next up, we have Men. This is just a very weird movie with a plot that, you know, I can understand might be a little too metaphysical. I certainly don't love that aspect of the film. Like, I think that that's kind of where it suffers for me, but where this movie really exceeds my expectations of what it was is like how visually and sonically beautiful everything in it is. This does horror really well. Like, this movie, the horror that we see here is so much more unnerving and frightening than anything that we would see in like a typical studio film, like a Blumhouse thing of just like jump scares. Like, it's very effective. So I'm actually going to put this I'll put this above Halloween Ends. So next up, we have The Menu. And this was a treat. This is a movie that it manages to be fun and mysterious and engaging. Like, you will have no idea where the plot is going because it's always changing. There's new twists that are being added along the way. And it also just has like some really great performances, like from Ralph Fiennes, never say his name right, and Anya Taylor-Joy. I thoroughly enjoyed this one. I'm going to put this in watching on repeat. Next up is Mid-Century. I think this is a little too high concept for its budget because I was completely confused throughout the entire thing. Like, I don't want to speak to the actors or, you know, the other people involved, but it kind of seemed like they were confused about what movie this was too. But it just, the way that it translates onto the screen, it just comes off as being very silly and confusing. So this one actually really tried my patience. That I'm going to say, I'll put it above Day Shift. I really did not like Day Shift. Next up is Mr. Harrigan's Phone. This was a short story by Stephen King that should have been adapted into a short screenplay that was maybe 20 or 30 minutes long, because this did not need to be a 100+ minute movie. There's not really any horror here at all. Like a shorter runtime probably would have condensed the better aspects of the story and gotten rid of like a lot of what felt like filler. So I'm gonna say that I think it's perfectly fine for what it is. I'm gonna put it at the bottom of perfectly fine though. And then after that, we've got My Best Friend's Exorcism. This was a cute movie, but it was more of like a coming of age comedy than anything else. So the exorcism aspect of it, I don't think it was done very successfully. That, it kind of went off the rails by the end. Like, again, this is a movie that I don't remember. I think it was perfectly fine, to be honest. I think that I will let's put it above Harrigan's Phone. All right, next is Nanny. This mostly falls back on that more metaphysical horror, where like the true horror more so exists in the state of mind rather than a tangible force. Obviously, this is nothing new. A lot of movies like this exist, and they're well done. Like, I think this movie is no exception to that, but it's the kind of movie that I don't gravitate towards. So like a lot of the horror that came about in it wasn't for me. But having said that, I think that this is still perfectly fine. I'll put it here. I feel like I'm underselling the movie. It is good, but it's just not a conventional horror movie. Like, a lot of people are not going to go into this and be happy with what it is, but I still think that it was well done. Next up is No Exit. This was a great movie. I think that this was very well done, just in terms of being a mystery thriller with plenty of horror elements to it as well. And considering that this movie takes place almost entirely in a single setting location, as was the case with a lot of the other movies here, it does kind of transcend, a lot of like the smaller budget movies. I'm gonna say that this was really good. I'm gonna watch this again. I'm gonna put it below the menu. Then we come to Nope. I've still only seen this movie once. I will be watching it again very soon. I had hoped that I would watch it again before this, because I feel like with Jordan Peele movies, like, you have to watch them once to get kind of like just the initial response to it, and then you have to watch it again to kind of get it more on a cerebral level. But I think that my takeaway was positive. I know that there's been a lot of criticism towards this and Jordan Peele specifically, but I think that what's so great about Jordan Peele as a director is his approach to filmmaking and film marketing, really, because it kind of harkens back to the old days of like William Castle, where the movies were kind of all about the gimmick and the mystery and how to get those people in the theater seats. And I imagine that that's going to be a continued theme for him. I can understand why that might be unappealing for some people at the end of the day, because they probably want something more logical, but I still found this to be an enjoyable ride, and I will continue to support Jordan Peele as a filmmaker, because I think that his career is going to be marked by making movies that will continue to be original ideas. Like, we're never going to see the same Jordan Peele movie twice. Like, everything that he takes on is going to be a completely new thing, and they're not always going to be the best. I would put this in watching on repeat, because I will watch this again. I will own it. I'll say above Men, below Fall. Fall really freaked me out. That's the only reason why. Next, we have Orphan: First Kill. This is obviously a prequel. The problem here, and I've talked about this before, is that prequels are really like the worst form of horror movie content, because you're essentially taking a premise that we already know the outcome of and stretching that into a 90, 100, 110, 20-minute long movie. It does not need to even exist. This one in particular, it didn't need to be a prequel. They probably could have done a sequel. Right off the bat, what I didn't like is how we are treated to a 20-minute sequence of her escaping the asylum that we already know is going to happen, and then we see her kind of like set up and like how she's going to stay with his family. And I think that where this movie does succeed is that there is a twist that is introduced in the second act. The problem is that they don't capitalize off of that twist. They kind of get maybe like 5 or 10 minutes out of it, and then the movie just kind of is rushed into the third act, which kind of like more so felt like an abridged version of the first movie's ending. I think that this movie is, I don't want to say trying my patience, because there is stuff that I enjoy here, so I'm going to put it in perfectly fine. It kind of pains me that I'd be putting it this high. I'll put it above Mad God. Next up, we have Pearl. And okay, now I have to kind of amend what I said, because I just talked about how prequels are awful and should not be made. This is the exception to that rule, because Pearl is not a story prequel. It's not a prequel to X. It is a character prequel. It's an origin story, but even as a prequel, this doesn't go the typical route that most movies would, like a Texas Chainsaw New Beginning of how did they initially become killers, and like giving us answers to certain questions that like we never asked for. So it's really like deeply rooted in kind of like the emotional center of this character and her world, rather than just like plot contrivances and just like stuff like how are we going to line up these two premises that are 60 years apart. So just the fact that they forego any of that and just focus on the character, really more of like its connections to X are more spiritual, and also just like Mia Goth, like great performance here. Really this year's best. I think like her and Ty West, they wrote this together, creating a despicable character, but also like allowing for us, the audience, to, feel like a deep empathy for them. That is no easy feat. So this is one of my favorites of the year. I'm going to put this in instant favorites, because this is something that I'm going to remember for a long time to come, and I'm going to be watching this forever. So that's where this one's going. Next up is Pray for the Devil. This movie was about 90 minutes long, maybe less, but the thing is, it felt longer. It felt like it was 2.5 hours. And that is not a good thing, because nothing happens in this movie. It's just one of those like so unremarkable and pedestrian Catholic horror movies, which already like I don't like movies really like about exorcisms. Like it's not my favorite subgenre. Like this whole thing just feels like it was stripped of any sense of horror or big exciting set pieces. Like all I remember is impatiently waiting for the credits to roll. But honestly, like this is so forgettable. This is time I'll never get back. I'll probably put it above Firestarter. Next we have Prey, the Predator movie. I guess this is kind of a prequel too, but not really, because it's not a prequel to any story that we've seen. It's just the Predator in a different time. Honestly, I don't remember much about this movie. I remember enjoying it. I guess that's the issue when you consume so many movies in a year. You're bound to forget some of them. Predator is not really a franchise that I'm like terribly enthusiastic about, so I guess it just kind of got lost in the shuffle for me, but I think it's on the higher end. It's not good enough that I'd consider it an instant classic. I don't know when I'll watch it again. I'm gonna say it's perfectly fine. I will put it at the top of perfectly fine, because I think that I probably enjoyed it better than Invitation and all that. Next up is Raven's Hollow. This was another Shudder release. This one is kind of like a fictionalized story about Edgar Allan Poe. So again, it's a period piece, and I think that, just in terms of movies, like the farther they go back in time, the harder it is to connect with the story. Obviously, like I said, it's not a deal breaker. Like there are certain things that you can do to make the movie more engaging, but it again, like it falls into the trappings of becoming too consumed with the small details rather than like telling a really good story. But I think for the most part, this one is fine. It definitely, starts off better than where it ends, but the mystery really takes a long time to reveal itself. And by the end, I've completely lost all interest. So I'm going to say that this is, I'm going to put it trying my patience, just because we've got so much imperfectly fine right now. Next up, we have Resurrection. I feel like any movie that has resurrection in its title is automatically cursed, whether it be Halloween or Alien. It's another one of those movies that, like Nanny, leans into this abstract idea of horror, where I personally would have preferred a movie that was more logical or grounded, because like it kind of like goes off the rails into just fantasy. And I think that at its core, this movie has a really great performance by Rebecca Hall, but that's really my only takeaway from it. So I'm gonna say I'll move Raven's Hollow up to perfectly fine, because I think it's not bad. Okay, let's do that. Fuck, these lists are hard, let me tell you. Next we have Run, Sweetheart, Run. This is another movie, where it started off very intriguing. It became more nonsensical as it went along. This movie is really like one big giant chase scene from start to finish, which I do like, but as it gets to the end, I think that they try to explain the monster and it really takes the piss out of it. And I tuned out at that point. I'm gonna say that this is fine. I'll probably, let's put it there. Let's put it under Christmas, Bloody Christmas. Next is Saloum. This was quite a slow burn, and it has a very unique premise. It's about mercenaries in Senegal, and it has a lot of twists and turns along the way. They kind of get stranded. It's just not terribly memorable, but not as forgettable as a lot of the other Perfectly Fines. I'm gonna say this is Perfectly Fine. I'm gonna put it, so I'm saying let's, this is a consensus. I'll put it above Orphan First Kill. All right, Scream 5. Of all the horror movies that came out this year, which were sequels or requels or requel sequels, I think this is probably the best one. Even though I've loved all of the Scream movies so far, I'm not saying that this is my least favorite of them. You've seen my rankings, it's not, but I do find this to be the least rewatchable. I still think that this is a very strong movie, but there's not a lot of standout moments or epic set pieces in this. A lot of the scenes, felt like big continuous stretches across the movie. Every time we went to that hospital, it felt like we were there for 20 minutes. So it just felt very stagnant in a lot of places. The ending also is kind of rushed. That's a criticism I've heard from a lot of people. Also, the script, I think it's kind of lazy. So I think that there's a few things that probably could have been given a once over, and not to mention the heavy reliance on stab and the connection to the original. I know that this was more so about being respectful to the core legacy characters and Wes Craven and the fans, but even though this is the least rewatchable for me, at least in terms of my perspective of it now, I do think that, obviously this is a movie I'm going to be rewatching for life. So this one for me is gonna go, I almost want to put Fall above it because Fall scared the crap out of me, but I know in my heart of hearts that Scream belongs above Fall. Next we have Sissy. This was really unexpected and a lot of fun. This was released on Shudder. It's kind of a revenge fantasy movie. This is horror comedy territory. It's these very unconventional movies where you empathize and root for the villain. There's just something about that concept that I really love, and this is definitely a memorable movie, and it's also uncomfortable in the best way possible and very satisfying as well, I'd say, by the end. So I definitely recommend this. I'm gonna put this in watching on repeat. I will definitely check this out again. I'm gonna say above Men and Halloween Ends. Next up we have Smile. Okay, this movie isn't breaking any new ground. This is basically The Ring or Final Destination, the type of death is coming to get you movie. But what this movie does do successfully is sort of how it sets up these really effective jump scares using sound design and misdirection. There are moments in this movie where even when I knew that a jump scare was coming, it still shook me to my core. My only real complaints here is that there's a section in the middle of the movie where the characters go on this trip during their investigation, and it's completely pointless. There's no new information that is gleaned that we as an audience couldn't have put together ourselves. And the problem with that is that the information that we find out is of no consequence for anything that comes after that. It never comes back into play. And that kind of brings us to the end, because I feel it's just a little too cynical for me. I would have liked something that was less by the numbers and just paid off more emotionally for everything that we had seen over the course of the movie. I think just for how effective it was, just in terms of how it rattled me, I'm gonna put this a lot higher than I think I would have. I'm gonna put this, let's put this below Nope. Speak No Evil. This was another one released on Shudder. Okay, I know I've criticized some movies on this list for having frustrating characters. This movie, okay, it's no different. The characters in this are very frustrating just based on the decisions that they make, or the lack of any action that they take. What's different here is that that's kind of the premise. Like that pertains to what this movie is about. It's just sort of like our passivity in the face of like clear danger or, you know, situations that we should be taking action against or removing ourselves from. And this movie is kind of built around this social commentary of people pleasers or just anyone who's afraid of confrontation, that they'll just blindly go along with anything just to appease others and make them happy. And it does that thing, that like unconventional horror thing, where it really like showcases the horror in the ordinary and how uncomfortable that can be. Just because it is so true to life, I find that it is genuinely terrifying, especially how dark the movie gets and where it goes. It's relatable. And that's what I love, is just like horror that is relatable, because not everything has to be fantastical. So this one actually is very high up on my list. I am actually going to, this might frighten some people, I'm going to put it above Scream. Studio 666. This was a fun little movie. This is the Foo Fighters, Dave Grohl. It's a horror comedy. It's like, that's really all I can say about it. It does feel like it's maybe another one of those movies that's like 20 years too late. Like it does have that late 90s, early 2000s vibe to it. Like this probably would have been more successful had it been released at that time. The humor and the jokes do get kind of repetitive. I'm gonna say that this is perfectly fine. I'm gonna say that this is, I'll put it above Run, Sweetheart Run. Now we have Terrifier 2. And first I should mention that I have not seen Terrifier 1. I'm told that this one is better, and I will see the first one at some point, but I was just blown away by how good this movie was. This really feels like old school, late 80s slasher. It's got tons of charm and heart. I think like that's really why it's so successful. I think like really if there's only one complaint I have about this movie is that it didn't need to be 138 minutes long. And that's not to say that it felt like it was all filler. Like I think that every frame of this movie, like every 138 minutes of this movie is shot to perfection. I mean, as it is, like I still like, I really love this. This was a huge surprise to me. I am actually gonna say watching on repeat. I still need to buy this. I'm gonna put this above Scream as well. Yeah, I think it was pretty terrific. We're next on Terror Train. Similar to Firestarter, this is a remake. And again, like Firestarter, I don't even think that I really liked the original Terror Train. The whole thing of this movie is that it felt like I was just watching a very bad retelling of a movie that I was already not too hot on. Having said that, it's not awful. I'd probably still watch it before Crimes of the Future, which I still can't wrap my head around. Now we're coming to Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Did anyone forget about that movie too? That was released like March. I don't think that this movie is as bad as it's gotten dragged through the mud for, but I would think that if you're gonna do like a big grandiose requel or reimagining or making it a direct sequel to the original, I would expect fireworks. And this was just it's just another Texas Chainsaw movie. I think it's perfectly fine. It didn't try my patience. I think I like it better than Orphan First Kill. I think that's where I'm gonna put it. Next is They Them. There's quite a few problems that are working against this movie for me. For starters, nothing happens for the bulk of the screen time. Like there's really no horror. There was no tension or atmosphere that felt palpable. At one point, the characters break into this Glee-inspired song and dance number. I get that they're trying to be empowering here. Like, I don't mean to shoot this movie down. Like, for anyone who feels represented and really like gloms onto this movie as something special, but it just feels like it was so focused on affirming queer identity that it left no room to be scary or have like well-crafted horror or even like effectively work those themes into the context of a slasher movie. This one really tried my patience. I don't consider it time I'll never get back. Like I don't think it was that terrible for me, but I'll put it below Day Shift. All right, Umma. This is kind of presented as a supernatural Korean folklore story, and I guess I was expecting something more akin to like The Grudge or The Ring, and I didn't get any of that. Like that's not what this movie is. That's not necessarily a bad thing because I don't like The Grudge or The Ring that much, but there really wasn't anything happening here. At least least that I can remember. Like it's just very forgettable for me. And like, again, this is more like one of those movies that it's more psychological and there's like themes of repression. This is one that I would say it's trying my patience, because it probably could have been better. Let's put it above Day Shift, because I just really hate Day Shift. VHS 99. I don't have anything bad to say about this film or like this series, really. Like, I haven't seen all of them. I think I saw the first one. I think it's just that like anthology shorts aren't really my thing, and neither is found footage. So like that combined together, it's not really my bag. What I do respect about this is that this is done by new and upcoming filmmakers. So this is like really them getting their platform to put their work out there, and they deserve that recognition. I feel bad to really include this in a ranking and rate it, but again, just remember that I'm not basing this on quality. I'm just basing it on what I personally enjoy. So movies like this try my patience, but for me, like I'd rather watch like a full like cohesive story. So okay, let's put it here. Because these movies just pissed me off, and I don't want to say that VHS 99 pissed me off. I should have like made another tier. Next up we have Watcher. This feels akin to something we might have seen from Dario Argento years ago. The premise is very Argento-esque, of just like having an American lead, having to navigate this strange foreign land and getting mixed up in a horrifying scenario. So I think the only thing that's really missing from Watcher is kind of a sense of mystery, because I feel like everything, including the Watcher's identity, is made aware to us way too soon. You guys know me, like I love murder mysteries, so I wish that there was more of like that aspect to the movie, but as it is, it's more thriller-esque. I think that they wanted to go for more of a story about this woman being gaslighted and having nobody believe her. But this is a really good one. I thought it was very effective. And I feel like if this was Dario Argento, this probably would have been one of his better, more contemporary films. But I'm going to put this in watching on repeat. Let's say I'm going to put it above Nope. No, sorry, below Nope, above Smile. Next up is Werewolf by Night. Technically, this is a TV special that's 50 plus minutes long. This is part of the MCU, and I think a lot of people do consider this to be a horror movie, so I included it here. I watched it. I'll just get this out of the way. I'm not a fan of Marvel movies. I mean, I've seen a lot of them, but I've kind of like tapered off in the last few years, and I don't really know how this connects to the movies, but I will say that this was very stylized. Like it's got this feel of like a 1930s, or like, you know, werewolf movies from the 30s. I think that worked well for it, like its style, but I didn't like that there's so much exposition. You know, with such a limited runtime of like 50 minutes, I feel like I would have liked to see something more action oriented. And this one spends about 20 minutes of just like talking and setting things up before anything really starts. And then even then it's broken up with like a lot of scenes of just more exposition that by the time it was over, I had no idea what was going on. I was so disinterested, you know, and just because it is part of the MCU, this is not very high up for me. I'm gonna say trying my patience. I'm gonna put it there. Next is Who Invited Them. The problem with this one is that it kind of suffers from having no teeth. Like it's a very interesting setup with a very slow burn unraveling. So it does feel like there's this escalating threat, but the problem is that it never pays off. It holds back way too much when it should have been a little edgier, so that by the time like we really do get to the violence, it's so underwhelming when it does finally happen. Like it's perfectly fine. Oh wow. Let's say here. Again, there's so many movies, 58 movies. This is gonna be very arbitrary, but just for the sake of like trying to wrap this up here, because we got 2 left. The next one is A Wounded Fawn. This is another Shudder release. I still don't really know what to think of this movie. It was like similar to Barbarian. This is a movie that starts out as something completely different than what it turns into, and I can't say that I particularly really liked where it went. It goes to these David Lynchian levels of abstract and absurd and like dreamlike almost, that I felt like I was like left behind, like I was left out of the loop. So, you know, this is very imaginative and visually charged, but it's just not what I was expecting, and it wasn't what I wanted. So it was kind of a letdown. So I'm actually gonna say that this is trying my patience. Let's put it above the Cellar. And then we get to X, our last movie, alphabetically, and I freaking love this movie. This came out in March, and this was my favorite movie when it was released, like favorite of 2022. And I was wondering, you know, how long it would be until something else dethroned it or overtook it. And it honestly, it never happened. Like, this for me is my favorite of 2022. And I think that like what like works about this is that like this movie has beautiful cinematography. This really transports you back in time. And, you know, even though a lot of this feels like homage, it's a different kind of homage than anything like I've ever seen before, because it's a lot less fan servicey and more artistically driven. Like, there's some really spectacular and gory kills here too. I just put this one above Pearl because it's like, it does have more of a sense of horror to it, but just in terms of like the X franchise, which I will call a franchise now because we know we're getting Maxine, this has kind of been my new favorite thing to happen to the horror genre, because it was just so unexpected that it's instant favorites. If you want to check out more horror movie tier lists just like this one, you can click on this playlist right over here. But until next time, I've been Zach Cherry. Thank you so much for watching, guys, and I will be right back.